The great hall went dead silent. Not the respectful hush of courtiers, but the jagged, breathless quiet of prey, realizing the predator is loose. King Gideon bypassed the high-born woman, swathed in gold silk, the bride he was supposed to claim. He stopped in front of a servant. Nora. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't speak. He grabbed the back of her neck, his large fingers digging into her skin, and his teeth broke the flesh of her collarbone. Chaos didn't follow. It exploded. Lye soap burned. That was the only coherent thought rattling in Nora's skull as she scrubbed the flagstones of the great hall. Her knuckles were cracked, weeping thin lines of red that washed away in the murky bucket water. The cold of the stone seeped through her thin woolen tunic, settling deep into her joints. It was the dead of winter, and the keep was a draughty, miserable fortress of damp rock and dying fires. Tonight was the bonding feast, a night of political theatre wrapped in the guise of sacred tradition. Nora didn't care about the politics of wolves. To her, the Lycan lords were just massive, heavy-footed men who tracked mud across the floor she had just cleaned. They ate too much, drank until they reeked of sour ale and fermented apples, and possessed tempers that could end a servant's life with a backhand. She wrung out the heavy bristle brush, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Being mute was a curse in the lower villages, but in the king's keep, it was a shield. She had no voice to object, no tongue to slip and offend a nobleman. She was simply a fixture, furniture that swept the floors. The heavy oak doors swung open, letting in a blast of freezing wind and the frenetic energy of the kitchens. Martha, the head cook, lumbered in, her face red and slick with grease. "Get up, girl," Martha hissed, kicking the side of Nora's wooden bucket. The dirty water sloshed over the rim. "They're seating the high table. Wash your hands. You're pouring the spiced wine tonight. And scrub that soot off your jaw." Nora pushed herself up, her knees popping loudly in the quiet hall. She wiped her hands on her coarse apron, the friction doing little to warm her numb fingers. Pouring wine at the high table meant standing within striking distance of the king and his intended. It meant being seen. She hated being seen. By the time the sun fully set, the great hall was a suffocating cavern of noise and heat. Two massive hearths roared at either end, but the warmth barely pierced the chill of the room. Instead, it just cooked the smells together. The thick, cloying aroma of roasted boar, the sharp tang of bruised pine needles scattered on the floor, the metallic scent of unwashed armor, and the heavy, musky pheromones of 300 wolves confined to one room. Nora stood perfectly still against the tapestried wall behind the high table, a heavy iron pitcher of mulled wine clutched to her chest. The metal was hot, searing her palms, but she welcomed the pain. It kept her awake. It grounded her. Lady Beatrice sat at the center of the table. She was a vision of northern wealth, draped in heavy golden silk and furs that looked softer than a cloud. Her hair was tightly braided with silver wire. But underneath the heavy floral perfume she wore, something imported and sickeningly sweet, like rotting lilies. Nora could smell her nerves. Beatrice was afraid. Her delicate fingers picked at the roasted meat on her plate, tearing it apart, but never bringing it to her lips. She was a prize mare brought to a wolf's den, expected to breed and smile. Then, the atmospheric pressure in the room dropped. The low hum of conversation didn't taper off. It died instantly. The clinking of goblets ceased. Even the fires seemed to stop crackling. King Gideon walked into the hall. He didn't strut or pose like the lesser lords. He moved with a heavy, rolling gait, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the air itself was a physical weight he had to push through. He wore no crown. His dark hair was shaggy, damp from the snow, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. He looked less like a monarch and more like a weary mercenary who had been dragged out of a frozen ditch. But the power rolling off him was undeniable. It made the air taste like copper. It made Nora's teeth ache. He took his seat beside Beatrice. He didn't look at her. He didn't offer a greeting to the hall. He just stared at the empty wooden trencher in front of him. Beatrice leaned in, her smile tight and practiced. "My king," she murmured, her voice like glass scraping against stone. "The winter road was harsh, but I am glad to finally be by your side." Gideon grunted, a low, vibrating sound in his chest that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a growl. He reached for his empty goblet and slammed it down on the table. A demand. Martha caught Nora's eye from across the room and gave a frantic, jerky nod. "Go!" Nora tightened her grip on the searing iron pitcher. She kept her head down, tracing the irregular lines of mortar between the flagstones, praying that the dull grey of her woolen tunic would let her melt into the stone itself. She stepped forward, the heat of the hearths pressing against her back, and the oppressive, terrifying heat of the Alpha King looming right in front of her. Her boots made no sound against the stone. Nora had spent years perfecting the art of walking like a ghost. She approached the high table from Gideon's right, keeping her chin tucked to her chest. Up close, the king smelled entirely different from the rest of the hall. Beneath the wet wool and old leather of his tunic, there was a scent of raw, biting winter air. Pine sap. Deep earth. A storm about to break. It was a terrifyingly wild smell, completely at odds with the carved stone and tapestries of his keep. Nora reached over his broad shoulder, her hands trembling slightly from the sheer weight of the pitcher, and the exhaustion settling into her bones. She tilted the spout. The thick, dark red wine poured into the silver goblet, steam rising from the surface, carrying the sharp scent of cloves and cinnamon. She pulled back cleanly, not a single drop spilled. She let out a slow breath through her nose, ready to retreat to her shadow against the wall. "Fill mine." Beatrice's voice was sharp. It wasn't a request, it was a whip crack. Nora shifted to her left, moving behind the king to reach Beatrice's side of the table. The space between Gideon's massive chair and the wall was narrow. As Nora squeezed past, her coarse wool skirt brushed against the back of Gideon's chair. He stiffened. The movement was barely perceptible, just a sudden rigidness in his spine. But Nora felt it. Her stomach plummeted. She hurried her step, anxious to get away from him, and leaned over Beatrice's shoulder. Beatrice shifted suddenly, turning in her heavy wooden chair to look at a lord at the adjacent table. She didn't look back. She just shoved her goblet blindly toward Nora. The heavy iron pitcher met the silver goblet in mid-air. Clank. It was a small sound, a minor miscalculation of space, but the result was immediate. A wave of steaming, dark red wine sloshed over the rim of the goblet. It didn't hit the table. It splashed directly onto Beatrice's lap, soaking into the pristine, shimmering gold silk of her dress. Nora froze. The world seemed to slow down. She watched the dark stain spread, turning the gold into the color of dried blood. Beatrice looked down. For a second, her face was completely blank. Then, her lips peeled back, exposing perfectly white, perfectly human teeth. She stood up so fast her heavy chair scraped violently against the stone, the screech echoing in the sudden silence of the hall. "You clumsy, half-witted bitch!" Beatrice shrieked. Before Nora could shrink back, before she could raise her burned hands to defend herself, Beatrice swung. The back of her hand connected with Nora's cheekbone with a sickening crack. The force of the blow threw Nora off balance. Her worn boots slipped on the floor. She crashed down hard onto her hands and knees, the heavy iron pitcher hitting the stone with a deafening clang. Scalding wine splashed across Nora's forearms. She didn't cry out. She physically couldn't, but her mouth opened in a silent gasp of pure agony. The hall was dead. No one moved. No one breathed. To strike a servant was common, but to cause a scene at the bonding feast, right next to the king, was dangerous territory. Nora kept her head pressed toward the wet stone, her entire body shaking. She tasted copper in her mouth, blood from the inside of her cheek. She waited for the guards to drag her away by her hair. She waited for the king to order her to the whipping post. Instead, a chair pushed back. Slowly. Gideon stood up. Nora couldn't see him, but she felt the shift in the room. The oppressive weight of his presence suddenly intensified, pressing down on her lungs until she couldn't pull in a breath. "My king!" Beatrice stammered, her rage faltering into sudden, panicked backpedaling. "Forgive the disruption. This filthy creature ruined the silk from my father's weavers. I will have her dealt with in the courtyard. Quiet." Gideon's voice wasn't loud. It was a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the tables, but it carried the weight of an absolute command. Beatrice snapped her mouth shut, her jaw clicking. Heavy boots stepped around the table. They stopped inches from Nora's face. She stared at the mud caked on the dark leather. "Look at me." Nora squeezed her eyes shut. If she didn't look, maybe she wouldn't exist. Maybe the stone would open up and swallow her. A large, calloused hand gripped her chin. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't brutal either. It was completely unyielding. Gideon forced her head up. She opened her eyes. His face was unreadable. His eyes were flat and dark, like wet stones at the bottom of a river. He wasn't looking at the red mark blossoming on her cheek. He was staring directly at her throat. He dropped to one knee, bringing himself down to her level on the filthy, wine-soaked floor. The entire hall of 300 lethal predators watched in stunned paralysis as their alpha king knelt in front of a nameless, mute scrub girl. Gideon leaned in. His nose brushed the skin just beneath her jaw. He inhaled deeply, a long, shuddering breath. He smelled of pine, of snow, of something terrifyingly ancient. "Mine," he whispered, the word vibrating against her collarbone. Nora tried to scramble backward, panic finally breaking through her paralysis. Her hands slipped in the spilled wine. She didn't get far. Gideon's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the back of her neck. He held her firmly in place. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He opened his mouth and sank his teeth into the tender flesh where her neck met her shoulder. Pain flared, bright and blinding. Nora's back arched, a silent scream tearing at her damaged vocal cords. The bite wasn't a nip. It was a deep, claiming puncture that locked onto her very pulse. Fire poured from his teeth into her veins, searing away the cold of the stone, the sting of the lie, the burn of the wine. Around them, the silence shattered. Beatrice let out a horrified, ear-piercing scream. Chairs crashed backward as lichen lords leapt to their feet, their eyes flashing gold and amber in the firelight. Growls erupted, a deafening cacophony of confusion, outrage, and challenged instincts. The great hall descended into absolute madness, and in the center of the chaos, the king held his bleeding servant against his chest, refusing to let go. The pain was not a clean slice. It was a crushing, tearing pressure that felt as though the very hinges of Nora's jaw were being unseated. Gideon's teeth locked into the thick muscle of her neck, scraping against the collarbone. Heat, localized and intense, flooded the puncture wounds, radiating down her shoulder and up into her scalp. It felt like hot wax poured directly into her veins. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs seized, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated shock to her nervous system. She tasted the stale, metallic tang of her own mouth, the copper from where her cheek had split against her teeth. Her hands, still blistered and slick with the spilled, spiced wine, scrabbled uselessly at the heavy wool of Gideon's tunic. She wanted to push him away. She wanted to claw his eyes out. But her fingers merely slid off the wet, coarse fabric, leaving streaks of red wine and grey dishwater across his chest. Above them, the great hall erupted into a frenzy of noise. Beatrice's initial shriek devolved into a wet, choking sob. chairs splintered against the flagstones as heavy lichen lords shoved away from the tables. The collective sound was deafening, a guttural overlapping of roars, the scraping of iron-shod boots, and the sharp, terrifying shing of broadswords clearing leather scabbards. Gideon did not flinch at the noise. He remained anchored to Nora, his jaw firmly set in her flesh. Slowly, deliberately, he drew the heavy scent of her deeply into his lungs, his chest expanding against her crushed hands. Then he pulled back. The tearing sensation made a sickening, wet sound. A fresh wave of agony spiked through Nora's neck, and she finally drew a ragged, whistling breath, her throat clicking as she fought for air. Gideon's face was inches from hers. His lips were smeared with a bright, wet crimson. His eyes, previously dull and flat, were now bleeding into a luminous, unnatural amber. The pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. He looked completely feral, devoid of any human reasoning. Yet his hands, one still clamped on the back of her neck, the other now wrapping around her waist, were terrifyingly steady. "My king!" The shout cut through the animalistic growls of the room. Lord Wyatt, Beatrice's older brother, stood atop the high table. His heavy fur cloak was thrown back, and he held a long sword pointed directly at Gideon's chest. Wyatt's face was mottled red with fury, a vein pulsing dangerously hard at his temple. "You spit on our house! You defile the treaty for a floor-scrubbing mute!" Gideon stood. He didn't release Nora. Instead, he hoisted her up with him, dragging her limp, shaking body off the wine-soaked floor. He tucked her against his side, his massive arm acting as an iron bar across her ribcage, lifting her feet entirely off the ground. The sudden change in elevation made Nora's head spin. Dark spots danced in the corners of her vision. The king turned to face Wyatt. He didn't bother drawing the heavy blade strapped to his own hip. He merely stared at the trembling edge of Wyatt's sword. "Put the steel away, Wyatt," Gideon rumbled. His voice was no longer a human baritone. It was a layered, vibrating bass that seemed to originate from the stone floor itself, vibrating up through the soles of everyone's boots. "You promised my sister the crown," Wyatt bellowed, his grip tightening on the hilt, though he didn't dare step off the table. "You invited the northern clans to a bonding, and you mark a diseased cur in front of our elders? This is an act of war." Around the hall, several of the older lords nodded, their faces grim, their hands resting cautiously on their own pommels. The pheromones in the room were suffocating, a toxic mixture of aggression, fear, and challenged pride. It smelled like an approaching thunderstorm, heavy with ozone and the musky stink of predators cornered by their own instincts. Nora slumped against Gideon, her chin resting weakly on his chest. Blood leaked from her neck, soaking into the thick, dark wool of his tunic. The hot stickiness of it made her stomach heave. She pressed her eyes shut, wishing the darkness would just swallow her. She was a corpse already. No servant survived a lord's wrath, let alone a political crisis of this magnitude. "I promised the North an alliance," Gideon said, the words slow and dripping with a dangerous, barely contained violence. "And I will honor the trade routes. I will honor the border protections. But I do not bend my nature to a treaty." He shifted his weight, his amber eyes scanning the room, daring any of the 300 wolves to step forward. No one moved. The absolute, crushing dominance radiating from him felt like a physical weight, pressing the air out of the room. "The girl is mine," Gideon stated, the finality in his tone echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Anyone who questions the mark I placed on her flesh can step into the courtyard right now and bleed for the inquiry." Silence slammed back into the great hall. It was absolute. Even Beatrice stopped sobbing, pressing her hands over her mouth in sheer terror as she stared at the king. Gideon waited a full 10 seconds. The fires crackled in the hearths. A log shifted, sending up a shower of orange sparks. No swords were raised. Wyatt's blade wavered, then slowly, humiliatingly, lowered to his side. Without another word, Gideon turned his back on the high table. He adjusted his grip on Nora, pulling her tighter against his side, and began to walk. His heavy boots crunched over discarded bones and spilled food as he marched down the center aisle of the hall. He didn't look back. Nora hung limply in his grasp, her cheek resting against his chest, listening to the slow, heavy, terrifyingly calm thud of his heart as he carried her into the freezing, dimly lit corridors of the keep. The air in the king's private chambers was completely different from the rest of the keep. It lacked the oppressive dampness of the lower levels. Instead, it smelled heavily of old wood smoke, burnt pine, and a faint, lingering scent of unwashed dog. It was a massive, Spartan room. No tapestries softened the stone walls. A massive iron brazier burned angrily in the center, casting harsh, leaping shadows across a gigantic bed draped in scarred pelts. Gideon kicked the heavy oak door shut behind them. The latch clicked into place with a definitive, ringing finality. He didn't carry her to the bed. He carried her to a heavy wooden table near the fire and dropped her onto it. Nora hit the solid oak hard, jarring her spine. She scrambled backward on instinct, her booted feet kicking out as she tried to put distance between them. She hit the wall behind the table almost immediately. There was nowhere to go. She curled into a tight ball, bringing her knees to her chest, her blistered hands instinctively flying up to cover her bleeding neck. She was shaking so violently, her teeth rattled together. Gideon stood by the table, staring at her. The feral glowing amber had receded from his eyes, leaving them that dark, impenetrable riverstone color again. He looked exhausted. The deep lines bracketing his mouth seemed carved from granite in the firelight. He ran a large, dirt-stained hand through his damp hair, releasing a long, heavy exhale that puffed into the frigid air. He didn't speak. He turned away, his heavy boots scuffing the floorboards as he walked to a wooden washstand. Nora watched him, her breath hitching in short, painful gasps. Her cheek throbbed violently where Beatrice had struck her, the skin tight and swollen. But the real agony was her neck. The puncture wounds felt like they were filled with crushed glass. Every erratic beat of her heart pushed a fresh spike of pain through her shoulder. She pressed her palm harder against the wound, feeling the warm, sticky flow of her own blood seeping through her fingers. She heard the splash of water, the clinking of a glass vial. Gideon returned. He held a wet linen cloth in one hand and an uncorked dark glass bottle in the other. The sharp, eye-watering fumes of clear, distilled spirits hit Nora's nose a second before he reached out. Nora flinched violently, pressing herself harder against the cold stone wall. She shook her head, a pathetic, silent plea. "Stop moving," Gideon said. His voice was flat, tired. He didn't sound like a king. He sounded like a man tasked with a tedious, unpleasant chore. He reached for her wrists. Nora fought back. It wasn't a calculated rebellion. It was the pure, blind panic of a trapped animal. She kicked out, her heel connecting solidly with his thigh. It was like kicking a tree trunk. She tried to twist away, her fingernails clawing frantically at the back of his hand, leaving thin white scratches across his tanned skin. Gideon didn't growl. He didn't strike her. With terrifying mechanical efficiency, he simply overpowered her. He caught both of her wrists in one of his massive hands, pinning them against the table beneath her. His grip was an iron vice, completely immovable, yet careful enough not to snap her fragile bones. He leaned his weight forward, his hip pressing her legs flush against the wood, trapping her completely. Nora let out a choked, reedy wheeze, turning her face away, exposing the torn flesh of her neck. "I know," Gideon muttered, his face hovering inches above hers. "Brace yourself." He didn't use the wet cloth. He brought the dark glass bottle directly over the wound and tipped it. The crude alcohol flooded the puncture marks. If the bite was hot wax, this was a roaring campfire. Nora's back arched clean off the table. A silent scream tore through her damaged vocal cords, a harsh, scraping friction that tasted of blood and bile. Her muscles locked into rigid, shaking bands of agony. Her vision whited out, leaving only the smell of burning spirits and the crushing weight of the king holding her down. Slowly, the white-hot spike of pain dulled into a heavy, throbbing ache. Her vision cleared to the sight of Gideon wiping the excess blood and alcohol from her collarbone with the damp linen. His touch was not gentle. It was rough, pragmatic, calloused fingers dragging across bruised skin. "The venom needs to set," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the ragged, angry red circle now permanently scarred into her flesh. "If it gets infected, you'll rot from the inside out before the bond takes hold." Nora stared at him, her chest heaving. The bond. The word felt heavy, like a stone dropped into her stomach. She knew the lore of the high-born wolves. A mating mark wasn't just a claim of ownership. It was a biological tether. It fundamentally altered the weaker party. But she wasn't a wolf. She was a fragile, broken human who scrubbed floors for stale bread. Gideon released her wrists and stepped back. The sudden absence of his heat left her shivering violently. He set the bottle down and walked to the massive stone fireplace. He braced both hands against the mantel, staring into the flames. "I did not plan for this," he said to the fire, his voice tight. The muscles in his broad back were corded and tense beneath his ruined tunic. "I needed the Northern Army. I needed that pampered, screeching girl." Nora slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position, her legs dangling off the edge of the table. She felt dizzy, nauseous. She looked down at her hands. The skin on her palms was bright red and peeling from the searing iron pitcher, completely ignored in the wake of the bite. Gideon turned his head slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. The firelight caught the harsh angles of his face, highlighting the deep, internal contradiction warring in his eyes. He resented her. She could see it clearly. He resented the instinct that had forced him to kneel in the dirt for a scrub girl. "But the scent hit me," he murmured, almost to himself. He turned fully toward her, his gaze dropping heavily to the fresh, angry mark on her neck. And there was no other choice. He walked past her, heading toward an adjoining door. He stopped in the frame, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch. "Stay by the fire," he commanded, the flat, authoritative king returning. "Do not open the door. Half the court is looking for an excuse to tear you apart, and the guards out there belong to my father's old regime. They will not protect you." He stepped through the door, and it shut behind him with a heavy thud. A moment later, Nora heard the distinctive, grinding scrape of a heavy iron deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. She sat alone on the table, clutching her burned hands against her chest. The fire crackled in the grate, casting long, mocking shadows across the room. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was the Alpha King's marked mate, and she was locked in a cage. The scrape of the iron deadbolt felt louder than the screams in the great hall had been. It vibrated through the thick oak door and settled into the marrow of Nora's bones. She was alone. She didn't collapse into a weeping heap. Tears were a luxury for women who had someone to comfort them, someone to care that they were crying. Nora just sat on the edge of the heavy table, listening to the erratic, shallow wheeze of her own breathing. Her body was a map of localized agonies. The blooming bruise on her cheekbone pulled tight, swelling up toward her eye every time she blinked. The puncture wound on her neck throbbed with a heavy, syncopated rhythm that didn't quite match her heartbeat. But her hands were the worst. The burns from the searing iron pitcher were blistering fast. The skin of her palms was angry, shiny, and weeping a clear fluid. If she couldn't use her hands, she couldn't work. If she couldn't work, she starved. That was the unforgiving law of the lower keep. A useless servant was a dead servant. She slid off the table. Her boots hit the floorboards with a dull thud. The room was massive, meant to intimidate rather than comfort. There were no heavy tapestries to block the drafts, just cold, sweating stone and thick timber beams. The fire in the central iron brazier popped, spitting a shower of orange sparks onto the blackened hearthstone. Nora walked toward the washstand. Her legs felt hollow, her center of gravity skewed by the adrenaline leaving her system. She plunged her ruined hands into the basin of freezing, soapy water Gideon had left behind. The shock of the cold was violent. She bit down hard on the inside of her lip, tasting fresh copper as the freezing water attacked her raw nerve endings. She held them underwater until her fingers went entirely numb, the skin turning a mottled, dead white. It was a miserable, temporary relief. But it was all she had. She pulled her dripping hands out and looked around. The king's chamber was devoid of anything soft or welcoming. The massive bed in the far corner was a mess of tangled grey wolf pelts and heavy, scratchy wool blankets. It smelled fiercely of him. Pine sap, damp earth, crushed mint and ozone. Before tonight, that scent would have just been the smell of a dangerous man, a predator to avoid in the corridors. Now, it did something terrifying to her biology. The puncture wound on her neck flared, an answering pulse to the heavy scent in the room. A hot, unnatural shiver rolled down her spine, pooling heavy and warm in her stomach. It was a visceral, chemical reaction. Her human mind recoiled in horror, but the freshly injected venom in her veins craved the scent. It was a violation of the highest order, her own body turning traitor, aligning itself with the creature who had bitten her. Nora backed away from the bed, her stomach churning with a mix of nausea and that sickening, foreign warmth. She found a heavy, moth-eaten woolen blanket tossed over a wooden chest near the fire. She dragged it down with her forearms, refusing to use her blistered palms, and wrapped it tightly around her shivering shoulders. She sank to the uneven floor stones right next to the brazier. The heat baked her damp, wine-stained tunic, creating a cloud of sour, wet wool steam. Outside the thick stone walls, the keep was waking up to its new reality. It didn't sound like the usual drunken revelry of a feast night winding down. It sounded like a battlefield forming in the dark. Faint, muffled shouts echoed up through the floorboards. The heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots marching in unison down the lower corridors vibrated against the stone. And beneath it all, the continuous, guttural howling. It wasn't the haunting, melodic song of wolves calling to the moon. These were short, aggressive barks and deep, chest-rattling snarls. Challenges, threats. The pack was fracturing in real time. Nora pulled her knees to her chest, resting her unbruised cheek on her knees. She closed her eyes. She thought of the kitchens. She thought of the heavy iron pots, the smell of rising yeast, the familiar, calloused cruelty of Martha's wooden spoon against her knuckles. It was a miserable life, but it was predictable. She knew the rules. Keep your head down. Don't make noise. Scrub until the stone is clean. Now, she was the anchor to a sinking ship. The Alpha King had tethered himself to a stone, and the entire Northern Alliance was going to drag them both to the bottom of the river. She stayed curled by the fire as the hours crawled by. The flames died down to sullen, glowing embers, painting the room in shades of blood and rust. The cold of the room crept closer, sinking deep into her joints. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time her eyes drifted shut, she felt the phantom pressure of heavy teeth dragging across her collarbone, and she jerked awake, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Dawn didn't arrive with a stream of golden sunlight. It bled through the narrow glassless window slits as a bruised, sickly grey. The wind picked up outside, howling through the defensive stonework, carrying the sharp, bitter smell of impending snow. In the corridor outside, heavy footsteps approached. They didn't pass by. They stopped directly in front of the thick oak door. The heavy iron deadbolt scraped. Nora scrambled backward, her worn boots slipping on the floorboards until she pressed her spine flat against the warm stones of the hearth. The heavy oak door swung inward. Gideon stepped inside, bringing a gust of freezing, blood-scented air with him. He didn't look like a conqueror who had just asserted his absolute dominance. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night surviving an execution attempt. His dark tunic was torn at the shoulder, exposing a jagged, ugly gash across his collarbone that was still oozing sluggishly. His knuckles were split and severely swollen, caked in dried, blackish blood. The heavy, dark stubble on his jaw was coated in a thin layer of grey ash and dirt. He shoved the door shut, driving the iron deadbolt home with a violent, final thrust. He leaned his forehead against the rough wood for a long moment, his broad shoulders rising and falling in heavy, exhausted heaves. He held a small wooden tray in his left hand, the wood completely engulfed by his massive grip. Nora didn't move. She barely breathed, pressing herself into the stone as if she could phase through it. Gideon turned. His dark, impenetrable river-stone eyes found her huddled by the dying embers. He walked over, his heavy boots dragging slightly with fatigue. He dropped the tray onto the floorboards next to her. It held a hardened heel of dark rye bread, a wedge of pale, hard cheese, and a small, cracked clay pot. "Eat," he ordered. His voice was a raspy ruin, stripped of its commanding bass. Nora stared at the bread. Her stomach cramped violently with hunger, a sharp, twisting pain that rivaled her burns, but her throat felt completely swollen shut. She kept her arms wrapped tightly around her shins, refusing to uncurl from her defensive posture. Gideon let out a rough, frustrated sigh. He dropped into a crouch in front of her, the joints of his knees popping loudly in the quiet room. He smelled overwhelmingly of stale sweat, copper, and sharp adrenaline. It made the fresh bite on Nora's neck throb with a vicious, demanding heat. The venom recognized its creator. She hated it. She hated her body for responding to him. I said, "Eat." He reached out, grabbing her wrist and prying her arm away from her legs. Nora flinched, pulling back hard, but his grip was unyielding iron. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her blistered, ruined palms. He swore under his breath, a harsh, guttural string of curses in an old dialect she didn't understand. He let go of her wrist and picked up the small clay pot. He popped the cork with his thumb. The sharp, medicinal stench of sulfur, rendered animal fat, and crushed comfrey root instantly filled the air between them. "Hold your hands out," he commanded. Nora shook her head rapidly, pressing herself harder against the stone. Gideon's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his bruised skin. "I am not asking, Nora." It was the first time he had used her name. Hearing it in his heavy, gravelly voice felt strange. Wrong. No one used her name except the head cook, and that was usually followed by a command to scrub harder. He reached out and took her right hand. He didn't squeeze. He just held her wrist firmly, forcing her palm upward. He scooped a thick glob of the yellow salve with his fingers and began to work it into her blistered skin. His hands were massive, rough with calluses and old scars, yet his touch was entirely clinical. He wasn't gentle, but he was highly efficient. The salve was freezing cold, instantly numbing the agonizing, burning tightness of the blisters. Nora gritted her teeth, staring at the side of his face as he worked. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to demand why he had ruined her miserable, quiet life, why he had dragged her into the crosshairs of a feral nobility. But she had no voice, and even if she did, she doubted a wolf cared about the bleating of a sheep. "Wyatt took his men," Gideon said quietly, not looking up from her hand. 200 broadswords marched out of the keep an hour before dawn. They are blocking the northern pass. He released her right hand and took her left, repeating the process with the cold, foul-smelling grease. "The council spent the night demanding your head on a pike," he continued, his tone alarmingly conversational, as if he were discussing the winter stores. They argue that a bond requires consummation to be recognized by the old laws. Until then, it is just a mark they can cut off your shoulders. A cold spike of pure terror drove itself into Nora's chest. She tried to pull her hand away, panic flaring, but he tightened his grip just enough to keep her tethered to him. "I told them they could try," Gideon said. His eyes flicked up to meet hers. The flat, exhausted look was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering violence. "I broke 3 jaws to make the point stick, but I cannot fight an entire keep indefinitely, and I cannot leave this room without them coming for you." He finished spreading the salve and let her hand drop back into her lap. He picked up the heel of bread and shoved it into her fingers. "I did not choose this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, raw rumble. He leaned in closer. The smell of his blood and pine sap wrapped around her like a physical weight, making her lungs feel tight. "I walked into that hall, fully intending to claim the silk-wrapped bitch my counsel demanded. I needed the grain lines. I needed the swords to hold the southern border." He reached out, the back of his knuckles brushing against her unbruised cheek. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, trembling violently. "But then you bled," Gideon whispered. "You spilled the wine, she struck you, and you bled." The scent hit the air, and the beast ripped the reins out of my hands. He dropped his hand and stood up, towering over her in the dim, grey light of the freezing room. "You are my mate. My biology recognizes nothing else. It will kill anything that tries to take you, and it will kill me if I try to let you go." He looked down at her, his face a mask of bitter, exhausted resignation. "We are both trapped in this cage. So eat the bread. Scrub girl. You're going to need your strength." The rye bread was dense, sour, and full of grit. Nora chewed slowly, forcing her jaw to work past the localized swelling of her bruised cheek. The comfrey salve on her palms made her fingers slick, so she held the hardened crust with her wrists, pinning it against her chest to tear off small, ragged bites. It tasted like ash and old flour. She swallowed past the dry lump in her throat, the friction scraping against her damaged vocal cords. She didn't want to eat. She wanted to crawl under the heavy wolf pelts on the bed and disappear. But hunger was a primal, stupid thing. It demanded fuel, even when the body was meant for the slaughterhouse. Across the room, Gideon had not stopped moving. He abandoned the pretense of rest. He stripped off his torn, bloodied tunic, tossing it into the corner where it landed with a heavy, wet slap against the stone. He was built for violence. His torso was a landscape of old violence. Thick, raised lines of white scar tissue cut across his ribs and wrapped around his heavy shoulders. The fresh gash across his collarbone was ugly. It wasn't a clean sword cut. It was jagged, the flesh torn in a way that suggested teeth or heavy claws. He didn't clean it. He didn't bandage it. He ignored it entirely, walking over to a heavy wooden chest banded in iron. He threw the lid back. The sharp, metallic scent of gun oil and cold steel flooded the room, cutting through the heavy smoke of the dying fire. He pulled out a massive, two-handed broadsword. The blade was dull grey, entirely unadorned, meant for crushing armor and cleaving bone. He carried it to the heavy oak table where he had pinned Nora hours ago. He sat down on a short wooden stool, grabbed a flat, grey whetstone, and began to sharpen the edge. Shok. Shok. The rhythmic, grating sound of stone on steel filled the cavernous chamber. It was a monotonous, terrifying lullaby. Nora sat by the hearth, her knees pulled to her chest, the moth-eaten blanket wrapped securely around her shoulders. She watched him. She couldn't stop. It wasn't fascination. It was the hyper-vigilance of a prey animal, memorizing the movements of the wolf in its cage. But there was something else, too. A sickening, underlying hum beneath her skin. Every time Gideon dragged the whetstone down the length of the blade, the muscles in his broad back flexed and shifted, and every time they did, the puncture wound on Nora's neck throbbed. It wasn't pain anymore. It was a phantom heat, a deep, pulling sensation that felt entirely invasive. It made her stomach churn. Her body was trying to sync its rhythm to his. The venom he had pumped into her veins was actively rewriting her nervous system, dragging her human frailties into the orbit of his apex biology. She hated it. She dug her fingernails into her own shins, pressing hard enough to bruise through her thick woolen stockings. She needed her own pain to drown out the unnatural pull. Gideon paused. He didn't look up from the blade, but his heavy shoulders stiffened. "Stop that!" Nora froze. How did he know? He was 20 feet away, facing the opposite wall. "I can smell your distress," he muttered, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. "It spikes the adrenaline in the air. It tastes like burnt copper. Stop hurting yourself." Nora let her hands drop from her shins. The sheer humiliation of having no privacy, not even in her own silent panic, settled heavily on her chest. She couldn't speak, she couldn't fight, and now she couldn't even hide her own fear. Gideon went back to the stone. Shk, shk. An hour passed. The grey light filtering through the window slits deepened into a bruised, oppressive purple as the afternoon wore on. The cold in the room became brittle, seeping up through the floorboards. Gideon didn't rebuild the fire. He didn't seem to feel the cold. But then, the rhythm of the whetstone faltered. Shuck, clack. Gideon dropped the stone onto the table. He leaned forward, bracing his heavy forearms against the wood. His head dropped between his shoulders, and a harsh, shuddering breath rattled out of his chest. Nora watched, her brow furrowing. He was shivering. It wasn't a subtle tremble. It was a deep, violently suppressed tremor that shook his entire massive frame. A sheen of sweat broke out across his scarred back, catching the faint, dying light of the embers. The harsh smell of the room shifted. The pine and ozone scent grew rancid, spiking with the sour, metallic odor of a fever. He pushed himself off the stool. His legs were unsteady. He took a heavy, dragging step toward the washstand, gripping the edge of the wooden basin so hard the timber groaned under the pressure. He splashed freezing water over his face and neck, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. The bond. Nora remembered the hushed, terrified whispers of the older servant women in the laundry vats. An unconsummated alpha mark is a poison. It was designed to force the pair together. If the physical tether wasn't completed, the wolf's biology would reject the delay. It would burn the alpha from the inside out, driving him completely feral before his organs simply shut down from the strain. Gideon turned, his back resting against the wash basin. His eyes were closed. His chest heaved. The veins in his neck and arms stood out like thick, blue cords. He looked like a man being slowly crushed to death by invisible weights. He opened his eyes and looked at her. The dark riverstone color was completely gone. His irises were a blinding, unnatural gold, bleeding out to swallow the whites of his eyes. Nora stopped breathing. She pressed herself flat against the stone hearth. The terrifying, calculated warlord was gone. The beast had taken the reins. The heavy silence of the room stretched until it felt physically brittle. Gideon stared at her from across the chamber, his golden eyes unblinking, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid hitches. The fever was baking off him in waves. Nora could feel the unnatural heat from 20 feet away, an oppressive, suffocating pressure that made the hair on her arms stand up. Then, the heavy oak door rattled. It wasn't a knock. It was a violent, testing shake of the heavy iron handle, followed by the dull thud of a gauntleted fist against the thick wood. "Gideon." The voice on the other side was muffled by the oak, but the authority in it was unmistakable. It was Lord Bram. He was an elder, a man who had fought beside Gideon's father. He didn't use the king's title. Gideon didn't look at the door. He kept his burning, golden gaze locked entirely on Nora. But his jaw shifted, the muscles bunching tight. "The northern lords are calling for a siege," Bram called out, his voice raised to carry through the heavy timber. "Wyatt has sealed the pass. They are demanding the girl. They are demanding the stain on the treaty be scrubbed clean. You have until nightfall to open this door and hand her over, or they will bring up the battering ram and take her from the ash of your chambers." Nora's stomach plummeted into a cold, bottomless void. A battering ram. 300 feral, humiliated lichen lords tearing through the wood to drag her into the courtyard. She looked at the heavy iron deadbolt. It suddenly looked very small. Gideon finally turned his head toward the door. The movement was slow, mechanical, as if his joints were rusted shut. "Bram," Gideon rumbled. His voice didn't sound human. It was a guttural, terrifying vibration that rattled the loose mortar between the stones. "If you touch that door again, I will tear your throat out and feed it to the hounds." A long, heavy silence hung in the corridor. Then, the faint, metallic clinking of retreating armor echoed away down the hall. Gideon turned back to Nora. The effort seemed to cost him. He stumbled, his heavy boot catching on an uneven floorboard. He caught himself on the edge of the heavy oak table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wood. A harsh, wet cough tore out of his chest, spattering dark blood onto the floor stones. His body was failing. The beast was fighting the man, and the man was losing. He pushed off the table, taking a slow, agonizing step toward her. Nora scrambled backward, but she was already pressed against the wall. She clutched the moth-eaten blanket to her chest, her unbruised cheek scraping against the rough stone. The phantom heat in her neck spiked to a blinding intensity, matching the fever radiating from his skin. The venom screamed at her to close the distance. Her human mind screamed at her to run. Gideon stopped 5 feet away. He dropped to his knees. The impact sounded like cracking bone in the quiet room. He didn't reach for her. He braced his massive, trembling hands on his thighs, his head bowed, his shaggy, dark hair obscuring his face. The heat rolling off him was like an open furnace. He smelled of burning copper, sour sweat, and the heavy, intoxicating musk of a cornered predator. "I won't touch you," he ground out, the words tearing past his teeth. "I won't force a terrified, broken human to the floor just to save my own skin." He looked up. The golden light in his eyes was erratic, pulsing with the erratic, failing rhythm of his heart. Sweat dripped from his jaw, cutting clean tracks through the ash and dirt on his face. He looked pathetic. He looked terrifying. "But I cannot fight them like this," he wheezed, a dark line of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, smearing it across his knuckles. "If the fever takes my mind, the beast will break the door down itself. It will slaughter everything in its path until they put a spear through my chest. And then they will come for you." He slumped forward, catching his weight on his hands against the floorboards. His heavy shoulders heaved as he fought for air. The absolute king of the Northern Territories was bleeding out from the inside, crippled by a biological failsafe he had triggered by biting a scrub girl. Nora stared at the broad, scarred expanse of his back. She wasn't stupid. She understood the brutal arithmetic of her reality. If Gideon died to the fever, she was dead. If the lords broke down the door while he was paralyzed by the sickness, she was dead. The only thing standing between her and being torn apart in the courtyard was this massive, broken, terrifying man. And he needed her to fix him. The consummation. The word felt like swallowing ground glass. She looked at her blistered, weeping palms. She looked at the heavy, dark blood staining Gideon's chin. This wasn't a romance. There was no gentle wooing, no soft promises of safety. This was a hostage negotiation, written in blood and fever sweat. Slowly, her hands shaking so badly she could barely maintain her grip, Nora pushed the heavy woolen blanket off her shoulders. It pooled onto the dirty floorboards. She pulled her knees out from under her chin. She crawled forward over the cold stone. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at the heavy, pulsing vein on the side of his neck. She reached out with her slick, blistered hands, the comfrey salve sticking to the rough, sweaty wool of his remaining garments. She touched his burning shoulder. Gideon violently shuddered at the contact. A low, desperate, entirely inhuman whine tore out of his throat, and his massive hands shot out, gripping her waist to pull her into the inferno. His hands were like burning iron. As Gideon's massive fingers wrapped around Nora's waist, the sheer, crushing heat of his fever transferred to her cold skin. He didn't pull her down. He collapsed forward, burying his face into the curve of her unbruised neck. He breathed her in, a harsh, ragged inhalation that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface. There was no romance in the heavy, tangled collision of their bodies. It was clumsy, desperate, and driven entirely by biological panic. He pushed her back onto the uneven, freezing floorboards. The impact drove the breath from Nora's lungs in a silent wheeze. Gideon's weight was suffocating. He tried to brace himself on his forearms to keep from crushing her, but his muscles were violently trembling, betraying him. His chest heaved against hers. He smelled of sweat, raw adrenaline, and the bitter comfrey salve smeared across her blistered palms. Nora stared up at the dark, timbered ceiling. Her mind detached, hovering somewhere above the raw, terrifying reality of the stone floor. She focused on the coarse wool of his trousers, scraping against her bare legs. She focused on the heavy, erratic thud of his heart, hammering against her ribs. She didn't fight. She didn't have the strength, and she had already made her hollow choice. When he finally breached her, a sharp, tearing gasp tore through her damaged throat. Her back arched violently. Gideon froze. A guttural sound, part growl, part sob, ripped out of his chest. He tried to pull back, his golden eyes wide and panicked, the human part of him horrified by the pain he was inflicting. But Nora didn't let him. Driven by a survival instinct that bypassed logic entirely, she reached up with her slick, numbed hands and dug her fingers into the thick, scarred muscle of his shoulders. She pulled him back down. The venom in her veins flared. It wasn't just a localized burn at her collarbone anymore. The heat exploded outward, rushing through her bloodstream, flooding her nervous system. It acted as a vicious, fiery anesthetic. The sharp physical pain of the tearing flesh dulled, replaced by a heavy, consuming warmth that sank into her marrow. Gideon moved. It was a harsh, uncoordinated rhythm, entirely devoid of tenderness. It was the frantic effort of a dying organism trying to secure its anchor. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face to the side, pressing her unbruised cheek against the cold, gritty stone. She focused on the smell of the dead ash in the brazier. She waited for it to end. Suddenly, Gideon's back arched tight. His massive hands gripped the floorboards on either side of her head, his knuckles popping. A deep, chest-rattling roar tore from his throat, echoing off the stone walls. And then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was immediate. The oppressive, suffocating weight of the fever broke. The unnatural, baking heat radiating from his skin snapped, cooling rapidly into a normal, heavy warmth. The venom in Nora's blood stopped burning. It settled, weaving itself permanently into the fabric of her biology, leaving behind a strange, thrumming hum of energy. She could feel his heartbeat, not just against her chest, but echoing faintly in her own pulse. The tether was locked. Gideon collapsed entirely, his full weight pressing Nora into the floor. For a long minute, neither of them moved. The only sound in the room was their harsh, synchronized breathing. Slowly, Gideon pushed himself up. He didn't stumble. The violent tremors were gone. The sickly sheen of sweat on his skin had already begun to dry in the freezing air. He looked down at Nora. The feral, glowing gold in his eyes had stabilized. It was no longer the erratic, blown-out pupil of a dying beast. It was the sharp, calculated amber of an apex predator, fully in control of its faculties. He reached down, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing a sweat-dampened strand of hair from her face. The clinical roughness was gone. His touch was heavy, possessive, and terrifyingly calm. "It is done," he murmured. His voice was a deep, resonant bass again, the raspy ruin healed entirely by the completed bond. Nora didn't respond. She felt hollowed out, exhausted beyond measure, yet strangely grounded. Her hands, still smeared with the yellow comfrey salve, ached less. Before Gideon could stand, a deafening crash shook the chamber. Boom! Dust rained down from the timbered ceiling. The heavy oak door groaned, the thick iron hinges protesting against the stone frame. Boom! The battering ram. The sun had set, and the northern lords had come to collect the treaty's debt. Gideon stood up. The lethargy of the fever was completely eradicated. He moved with a terrifying, fluid lethality. He reached down, grabbing the thick woolen blanket Nora had discarded, and tossed it over her shivering body. He walked to the heavy table and picked up the broadsword he had sharpened. He didn't bother putting his bloodied tunic back on. He stood bare-chested in the freezing room, the scars on his torso standing out stark white against his skin. He gripped the hilt with both hands, rolling his heavy shoulders. Boom! Wood splintered. A jagged crack appeared down the center of the thick oak door. The heavy iron deadbolt was bending outward, screaming under the immense pressure. Nora pulled the blanket tightly around her neck, hiding the claiming mark. She dragged herself backward, putting her back flush against the stone wall of the hearth. She wasn't a scrub girl hiding from Martha's wooden spoon anymore. She was the anchor, holding the king's sanity in place. "Stay behind me," Gideon commanded, not looking back. He raised the heavy grey steel, pointing the tip directly at the center of the fracturing wood. Crack! The iron deadbolt snapped. The massive oak door blasted inward, slamming against the stone wall with a concussive force that rattled Nora's teeth. The dark corridor beyond was packed with armored men, the torchlight catching the glint of 200 drawn broadswords. Lord Wyatt stood at the threshold, his teeth bared, holding a heavy iron mace. Gideon didn't wait for a challenge. He didn't wait for a demand. He lunged into the breach. The heavy oak door is splintering, and the Alpha King is finally off his leash. Will Gideon slaughter the very lords he needs to hold his kingdom, or will the Northern Alliance drag Nora out into the blood-stained snow? The bond is permanently sealed, but the brutal war for the keep has only just begun. If you are completely hooked on Nora and Gideon's dark, gritty survival story, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss Part 10. Drop a comment below. Did Nora make the right choice, or did she just delay her own execution? Share this with your fellow dark romance addicts.